Thank you very much, William, and thanks to Tom McCoy for inviting me to talk here today. And I am going to share my screen now. If I have this together, here we go. All right. So, and thank you for this opportunity to, now I've got a window blocking something here. Okay, here we go. And thank you for this opportunity to give this short talk about composer and amateur mycologist John Cage. Cage was born in 1912 in Los Angeles and died in New York City in 1992, and is widely recognized as one of the central artistic figures of the 20th century. He produced visual artworks that are now in the collections of museums such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Tate, and other institutions. His poetry, philosophical essays, and other writings were published widely, and in 1988 and 1989, he delivered the Charles Eliot Norton Lectures at Harvard University. But Cage is by far best known as an experimental and avant-garde composer, and probably as the most influential American composer of the 20th century, with a prolific output that stretched from the 1930s to the 1990s. While many people may be familiar with his invention of the prepared piano in 1940, his musical contributions extended far beyond as a pioneer of chance operations and indeterminacy in music. Among his most radical works was the 1952 composition 4 minutes, 33 seconds, originally performed by the pianist David Tudor, in which the performer doesn't make any sounds. The piece consists actually of the sounds that are already always around us. While classical composers before him had explored the relationship of the 12 pitches of the chromatic scale, the language of tonality, and explorations of atonality, Cage took a much more radical approach to music, suggesting that every sound or group of sounds, whether apparently musical or not, could be considered music, and looked toward time and duration rather than pitch for structure. The New York Times wrote, as the unchallenged father figure of American experimental music, Mr. Cage wields an influence that extends far beyond sound alone. Indeed, the entire American avant-garde would be unthinkable without Mr. Cage's music, writings, and personality. Cage was very gregarious, and his social network was immense. He counted among his friends his creative and life partner, Merce Cunningham, with whom he's seen here, and also Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, M.C. Richards, and Marcel Duchamp, with whom, by the way, Cage studied chess. His social circle also included figures like Buckminster Fuller, Marshall McLuhan, and most notably for this talk, the botanist and mycologist Alexander Smith. The list goes on, including personalities like Joseph Campbell, John Steinbeck, and Octavio Paz. In his early years, Cage studied music with Henry Cowell and Arnold Schoenberg, and later studied Zen philosophy with T.T. Suzuki. By his own account, Cage's first encounter with mushrooms took place during the Depression. Living in Carmel, California, Cage found himself often hungry and with little money. He noticed a patch of mushrooms, took one to the public library, and attempted to determine its edibility. Cage left no record as to what specific sort of mushroom he had found, and we can only imagine Cage's challenge in trying to identify it by consulting 1930s era resources on mushrooms. As best Cage could tell, the mushroom, whatever it was edible, and so he cooked some and ate them. He suffered no ill effects, so for the better part of a week, he ate little other than mushrooms. But by the end of the week, he felt awful, apparently more from malnourishment than from anything dangerous in the fungi. By the early 1940s, Cage had crossed the country and had settled in New York City, where his stature as a composer began to grow. But in 1954, he and a number of artist friends, including the potter M.C. Richards, and filmmaker Stan Vanderbeek moved out of the city and up to Stony Point, New York, in Rockland County. There, perhaps 20 years after Cage's first encounter with mushrooms in Carmel, California, he began to see them during his long walks in the woods. He also took up an interest in foraging in general, hoping to make at least some of his meals with whatever he could find growing in the wild. When I moved to the country, I realized I was starved for nature, said Cage. I would day after day drop everything and just walk in the woods looking for mushrooms. Just paying attention to anything in nature and forgetting oneself a little bit results in days that pass very quickly. In another text, Cage said, I started taking walks in the woods. It was August. I began collecting the mushrooms, which were growing more or less everywhere. Then I bought some books and tried to find out which mushroom was which. Realizing I needed to get to know someone who knew something about mushrooms, I called the 4-H club in New York City. I spoke to a secretary. She said they'd call me back. They never did. The following spring, after reading about the edibility of skunk cabbage in Metzger's book on wild plants, Cage said, I gathered a mess of what I took to be skunk cabbage, gave some to my mother and father, who were visiting, to take home, cooked the rest in 3 waters with a pinch of soda, as Metzger advises, and served it to 6 people, one of whom, I remember, was from the Museum of Modern Art. I ate more than the others did in an attempt to convey my enthusiasm over edible wild plants. After coffee, poker was proposed. I began winning heavily. MC Richards left the table. After a while, she came back and whispered in my ear, do you feel all right? I said, no, I don't. My throat is burning and I can hardly breathe. I told the others to divide my winnings, that I was folding. I went outside and retched. Vomiting with diarrhea continued for about 2 hours. Before I lost my will, I told MC Richards to call Mother and Dad and tell them not to eat the skunk cabbage. I asked her how the others were. She said, they're not as bad off as you are. Later, when friends lifted me off the ground to put a blanket under me, I said, leave me alone. Someone called Dr. Zukor. He prescribed milk and salt. I couldn't take it. He said, get him here immediately. They did. He pumped my stomach and gave adrenaline to keep my heart beating. Among other things, he said, 15 minutes more and he would have been dead. Sometime later, I read about the need to distinguish between skunk cabbage and the poisonous hellebore. They grow at the same time in the same places. Hellebore has pleated leaves. Skunk cabbage does not. Despite the identification mishap with hellebore, Cage expressed his determination to carry on with edible plant and mushroom identification and called the local 4-H club again looking for help. As he recalled, they said, call Mrs. Clark on South Mountain Drive. She said, I can't help you, call Mr. So-and-so. I called him. He said, I can't help you, but call so-and-so who works in the A&P in Suffern. He knows someone in Ramsey who knows about the mushrooms. Eventually, I got the name and telephone number of Guy G. Nearing. When I called him, he said, come over anytime you like. I'm almost always here, and I'll name your mushrooms for you. As Cage began to learn about mushrooms, a social circle formed around his enthusiasm. But the group's lack of knowledge led them to take chances. Great quantities of it were growing near the road, Cage recalled. After hurried examination, I decided it was probably an agaricus. We filled bags and baskets. Guy Nearing had never seen it before. I decided to take it to town and serve it to friends at a party. Fortunately, no one the next day was ill. Lois, meaning the illustrator Lois Long, took specimens to Ann Arbor. Dr. Smith, meaning the mycologist Alexander Smith, immediately took down Iconus farlowianae and opened it to Stropharia rugoso. We had proven its edibility, though we did so foolishly. So all of you who appreciate Stropharia rugoso annulata, as it's now known, have Cage and his reckless friends to thank for determining its edibility back in the 1950s. In that story, Cage mentions a book, the Iconis Forloianae. In its day, this was the most important book published on fungi and was the collaborative effort of 4 botanists, 2 illustrators, and 2 publishers. Published in 1929, its production expenses ran in excess of $50,000 in an era when a lavish house cost $9,000. The book's title is an homage to William Gilson Farlow, a botanist and mycologist who authored a number of significant texts on fungi in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By 1959, through relentless study, Cage had become such an expert on mushrooms that he began teaching a course on mushroom identification at the New School in New York. He described it as very attractive to city dwellers who want an escape from cement. He also somehow ended up on an Italian television quiz show called L'Aschia o Raddoppia, which could be loosely translated as double or nothing. During Cage's 5 appearances on the show, he entertained the audience with performances of his music and also answered increasingly difficult questions about mushrooms. In the finale, with 5 million lira on the table, about $8,000 in American money, or about $70,000 today, Cage was asked to provide the 24 names of the white spored agaricus as listed in George Francis Atkinson's Studies of American Fungi. Cage named them all, and in alphabetical order. With his winnings, he bought a Volkswagen bus for the Cunningham Dance Company and a new piano for his home at Stony Point. A year later, in 1960, Cage would appear on CBS's I've Got a Secret. In 1962, John Cage, Guy Nearing, Lois Long, Esther Dam, and Ralph Ferreira co-founded the New York Mycological Society. Nearing was a specialist in fungi as well as lichens and had published a book on lichens in 1947. He, like Cage, was an avid chess player and wrote 6 books of poetry. This image from that same year of 1962 was taken during the group's first Chanterelle weekend, probably in Vermont. Here, an artist commemorates one of the first 2 outings of the New York Mycological Society in 1962, apparently inscribed by Cage, noting members John Cage, G.G. Nearing, Lois Long, Esther Dam, Dick and Allison Higgins, now better known as Allison Knowles, and others. A companion conch, also from 1962 and from one of the New York Mycological Society's first 2 forays, is inscribed Londonderry, Vermont, the favorite location of the Society's Chanterelle weekend. As the New York Mycological Society grew, it arranged not only forays, but also lectures, a newsletter, and culinary sessions, growing into a remarkably busy and influential organization. In 1964, the North American Mycological Association, or NAMA, honored Cage with its Award for Contributions to Amateur Mycology. It had given the same award in 1961 to Guy Nearing. And later in 1986, it would award it to Cage's longtime and close friend, Gary Linkoff, an early member of the New York Mycological Society who credited Guy Nearing and John Cage for introducing him to mycology. Linkoff was also a NAMA president and once instructed Martha Stewart on how to dredge puffballs in panko breadcrumbs. In the 1960s, Cage made money on the side, supplying mushrooms to New York's famed Four Seasons restaurant, founded by James Beard, which featured sculptures by Cage's friend Richard Leopold. But then misfortune struck. Cage said, "We brought such a great variety of mushrooms from Vermont to the Four Seasons, the cook was confused. They fired us." Cage's mushroom recipes from the 1950s and 1960s read like something out of an early Julia Child cookbook, with delightfully heavy use of cream and butter. In 1965, Vogue magazine published several of Cage's favorite mushroom recipes. One, called dog sup as opposed to ketchup, was a thick, dark sauce that required at least a year to cure before it could be used. There was a recipe for mushroom salad dressing, and also Cage's preferred way of preparing mushrooms, reprinted right here. You can never eat enough morels, said Cage, so the quantity you give each person depends on what you have hunted. The recipe for 1 pound of morels called for 1/3 cup of sweet butter, a 1/2 cup of flat champagne, a 1/2 cup of heavy cream, and salt and pepper baked in the oven. But Cage suffered terribly from arthritis and other ailments that had bothered him for years. By the early 1970s, his friends and neighbors, Yoko Ono and John Lennon, became concerned. Ono convinced Cage to try a macrobiotic diet, and Lennon sent over 6 macrobiotic cookbooks. Within weeks, Cage reported after changing his diet, his pain almost completely disappeared, and for the rest of his life, he maintained a macrobiotic diet, often bringing food with him when he traveled. Fortunately, mushrooms are well accepted in macrobiotic cuisine. Thank heavens, said Cage, mushrooms are okay. Even though Cage no longer cooked his mushrooms with butter and heavy cream, he remarked how much he admired Julia Child. I always loved her cooking, he told the New York Times. Once I was asked to be on a television show with her. Unfortunately, it was after I changed my diet. I had a dream that before the show I said, "Oh, Julia, I have something to tell you. I'm on a macrobiotic diet." She screamed and ran away. Cage's macrobiotic recipes are certainly healthier. A general recipe for any type of mushrooms reads, cut in reasonable pieces and saute in canola oil, not too much oil. Cover a little and then uncover to reduce liquid. Before it is all gone, add a little Bragg's. Taste to decide whether lemon is needed or pepper. Wherever he traveled, Cage was on the lookout for fungi. Once driving along a parkway, Cage spotted some mushrooms, parked, and went to harvest them. A police officer pulled up and informed him that motorists could stop only in case of an emergency. This is an emergency, Cage replied. In 1964, Cage published a landmark book, Silence, regarded as one of the seminal writings of the era. It was followed by others, including A Year from Monday, M, X, Empty Words, and other volumes. Many contain writings on mushrooms, and Cage's extraordinary enthusiasm about fungi helped drive interest in the field among his many readers. Silence includes the Music Lover's Field Companion, which begins, I have come to the conclusion that much can be learned about music by devoting oneself to the study of the mushroom. In some of his writings, Cage pioneered a new form of poetry called the mesostic. Not unlike an acrostic in which the first letters of each line form a word when read vertically, in mesostics, those words appear running down the center of the text. Various rules can be applied that limit the recurrence of these letters within the surrounding text. Here, the word amanita appears vertically. Cage used this playful form to sometimes create mesostics that were both lengthy and complex. And here, the word clitosoby runs vertically in part of a writing about Clitosoby tubescens, which we now call Armillaria tubescens. This mesostic and the previous one appear in a large work called Mushroom Book, part of which is written freely and part of which is in mesostic form. In 1972, Cage collaborated with friends Lois Long and Alexander Smith to create a collector's edition of Mushroom Book, limited to 75 copies. This illustrated book with 20 lithographs by Lois Long contains scientific notes by Alexander Smith and jottings from Cage, stories, thoughts, recipes, observations and quotes on mushrooms, especially taken from Henry David Thoreau. Cage's jottings about mushrooms overlap one another, creating an artwork that takes exploration to be fully experienced. This original printing of Mushroom Book is now essentially impossible to find and extraordinarily expensive, with nearly all copies in the hands of collectors or museums. Here, Lois Long and John Cage are seen working on the book at Hollander Press in spring 1972. By the time of Cage's death in 1992, at the age of 79, a great deal had been written about his music and other artistic contributions, but little had appeared that examined his contributions to mycology. That imbalance was corrected in 2020 with the publication of John Cage, A Mycological Foray, created by the independent publishing house Atelier Editions in cooperation with the John Cage Trust. A Mycological Foray consists of 2 volumes, gorgeously printed and contained in a slipcase. The first volume includes the previously mentioned short essay by Cage called Music Lover's Field Companion, and an insightful essay on Cage and mycology by Kingston Trinder. The book also contains a text piece by Cage, written in 1983, entitled Mushrooms et Variasionis. That is, it's intended to be read aloud as a performance piece over a period of 75 minutes. You can see the timings if you look closely on the edge of the page there. The publication features many archival photographs, especially by William Gedney and James Closty. Many of the images were taken at Stony Point, New York in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of my personal favorites were taken in Grenoble, France in 1972. And in particular, I really love this photo of Cage looking out over this landscape. The second volume in A Mycological Foray is a special reprint of the 1972 mushroom book itself, beautifully printed on large sheets that unfold. It's really the first time that most people have had an opportunity to engage with this remarkable work in a format that's similar to its original publication. In conjunction with A Mycological Foray, Atelier Editions also published a delightful little box entitled Every Mushroom is a Good Mushroom, which is a quote from Cage. This box contains dozens of cards featuring recipes by Cage, including the morel recipe that appeared in Vogue magazine, and contributions by other artists. The publication of John Cage, A Mycological Foray, caught the attention of both the art world and the mycological world, with reviews in the New York Times, Art in America, Forbes, Wired, The Guardian, and other publications. In 1993, a year after Cage's death, friends of Cage established the John Cage Trust, which is now based at Bard College in New York. In partnership with the Mid-Hudson Mycology Association, a local affiliate of the New York Mycological Society, the John Cage Trust sponsors the annual John Cage Mycology Weekend, featuring forays, talks, and conversations. You're seeing some images here from the 2019 weekend. There's also, at the University of California, Santa Cruz, the John Cage Mycology Collection, established in 1971, which holds books, correspondence, journals, and all sorts of ephemera, even a mushroom tie, as you can see here. And it may not be surprising to know that there's at least one mushroom named after Cage, the Cortinarius cagei, which I hope one of these days to find. A talk on John Cage and mycology could go on for hours, but unfortunately that's all the time we have for this evening. And I hope this brief talk has illuminated some things about Cage and his enthusiasm for mycology. I'll post my contact information and some other resources in the chat for those who would like to know more. And I also want to express thanks to those who helped make this talk possible and to provide a list of image credits. So thank you very much. And that's all from me.